Imagine a man who has everything, millions in the bank, properties scattered across the city. But he lives like a ghost, with worn-out clothes and the smell of old rain embedded in his soul. Why would someone choose voluntary poverty? And what would happen if this man's best-kept secret came to light? This is Harold's story, and how a fortune became his greatest prison and his only chance at redemption. The first time Harold walked into my office, he carried the smell of old rain. I can't quite explain it. It was as if the dampness had settled into his clothes, that brown coat frayed at the elbows and wouldn't come out. He sat down slowly, with that carefulness of someone who doesn't trust their own body, and stared at his hands. His nails were clean, but the skin around them looked like crumpled paper. There were dark spots on his fingers, the kind that appear with age and stay there like maps of a time no one remembers anymore. In that instant, I knew he wasn't just a man in mourning. He was a man on the run, hiding something much bigger than the pain of loss. I waited for him to speak. It's always like that in the beginning. People arrive carrying heavy silences, and my job is to let them settle in the space between us until they become light enough to turn into words. Harold took about 5 minutes. The clock on the wall marked each second. Tick, tick, tick. I could hear his breathing, irregular, as if he were measuring how much air he needed to begin. When he spoke, his voice came out low, almost a murmur. "Things aren't like they used to be," he said. Just that. He didn't explain what things. Didn't say when that used to be was. Just left the sentence there, suspended, like someone dropping a weight and hoping someone will catch it. I didn't catch it. I just nodded, showing I was listening, that the space was his to fill in whatever time he needed. He looked around the office. His eyes traveled across the bookshelves, the plant by the window, the couch where he was sitting. As if he were cataloging everything, mentally storing each detail. Then he went back to looking at his hands and went quiet again. The session ended like that, with more silence than words, but with the implicit promise that he would return. And he returned every week, always at the same time, always punctual. Harold had that kind of consistency that made me trust him, even without knowing exactly in what. In the first sessions, he assembled the puzzle of his own life in small pieces. Never telling everything at once, always leaving gaps I needed to guess at or wait for him to fill in later. He talked about his wife, Margaret. The name came out of his mouth with a reverence that hurt to hear. She had died 2 years earlier. Cancer, too fast for any treatment to make a difference. Harold described the last months with surgical precision. The hospital smell, the sound of machines, the texture of the blanket covering her legs, her skin, translucent in the final days, so thin he could see the bluish veins beneath. Reliving the details was a way of keeping her alive. And I, there, just listened. Each word, a weight. Each silence, an eternity. After she died, he said, the apartment became too big. It wasn't a big apartment, he hastened to clarify, but without Margaret there, each room seemed to stretch, gain empty spaces that didn't exist before. He would wake up in the morning expecting to hear her voice calling from the kitchen, the sound of the coffee maker, light footsteps in the hallway, but there was only silence. A dense, sticky silence that clung to the skin and wouldn't leave. Harold talked about money with a frequency that caught my attention from the start. He said he lived on a tight retirement, that he needed to save at the market, choose between buying beef or chicken because he couldn't afford both. He'd say that sometimes he skipped lunch, not because he wasn't hungry, but because it wasn't worth cooking just for himself. It was easier to eat bread with butter, drink reheated coffee, move on. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Harold had everything of a man forgotten by the world. The worn clothes, the shoes with worn soles. That way of talking about money like someone talking about water slipping through fingers. He wore the same brown coat in every session, even when it was hot outside. Said it was the only one he had, that it served him well, that he didn't need another. But there was something that didn't quite fit. Just a feeling I couldn't name, a kind of background noise that didn't fit into the melody Harold was playing. Maybe it was the way he spoke. The diction was careful, words chosen with precision. It wasn't the vocabulary of someone with little education. It wasn't the syntax of someone who had spent their life struggling to survive. And there was the posture. Even bent by the weight of years, Harold moved with a calmness that didn't match the anxiety he described. His hands trembled when he picked up the cup of water I offered, but the way he held it was delicate, almost ceremonial, as if he had learned to make small gestures last longer than they needed to. As if each movement was measured, thought out, executed with an intention that went beyond automatic. He never mentioned family beyond his wife, never talked about his youth where he had worked, how life had been before everything fell apart. When I tried to pull at those threads, he deflected. Not abruptly. It was subtle, like someone changing the subject without you noticing you're being led somewhere else. I asked about his parents once. He said they had died long ago, that it wasn't worth talking about. I asked about siblings. He shook his head, said he was an only child, and went back to talking about Margaret. But I knew Harold's story was much bigger than just that of a lonely widower. There was an untouched past, a secret he guarded with the same ferocity with which he protected his pain. The sessions began to develop a routine. Harold would arrive, sit, wait for me to ask how his week had been. He'd tell small details of daily life. The trip to the market, the conversation with the building doorman, the TV show he watched alone the night before. They were monotonous reports without drama, but loaded with a sadness that hung in the air like fog. He didn't cry, never cried, in all the sessions we had. But there was a contained moisture in his eyes, a fragility he hid behind a rigid composure. I began to notice other details. The watch he wore, for example, was discreet, with a worn leather strap, but the face had a quality that didn't match the rest of his attire. It wasn't a cheap watch. It wasn't the kind of thing someone with financial difficulties would buy or keep. When I asked about it, Harold looked at his wrist as if he'd forgotten it was there. Said it was from when he worked, that he'd received it as a gift, that he saw no reason to get rid of it. "Where did you work?" I asked. He hesitated. "In an office," he replied, then deflected again. That watch was the first crack in the facade he'd built, and I knew there was more behind it. It was in the 4th month of therapy that the first crack truly opened. Harold arrived more tense than usual. He sat and remained quiet longer than normal, his fingers drumming on the arm of the couch. I waited. Finally, he said he was thinking about making some changes. He didn't explain what changes, but the tone of voice indicated it was something important, something he'd been ruminating on for weeks. I asked what was going through his head. He took a deep breath, looked at the window, looked back at me, said he had some old investments, things he'd done in the past when he still worked, and that he was considering dealing with them. Maybe sell some things, reorganize, see if he could improve his financial situation. Investments. The word hung suspended in the air between us. I said nothing, just nodded for him to continue. Harold was choosing his words with even greater care than usual. As if testing the ground, seeing how far he could go without revealing too much. "Nothing big," he said quickly. "Just some applications he made decades ago when things were different, when he had a better salary. Now, it probably wasn't worth much, but maybe he could get something out of it." He said all this looking at the floor, his voice low, almost embarrassed. I let the silence work again. It's a technique I learned early in the profession when someone is about to reveal something important. Silence works better than any question. Harold fidgeted with his fingers, adjusted his posture on the couch, looked at his watch. Then he began to speak again. Slowly, like someone opening a door that has been locked too long and is unsure what they'll find on the other side. He had some properties, some real estate scattered around the city, inherited from distant relatives, bought at strategic moments, accumulated over decades of work in an area he'd never mentioned before. It wasn't little. There were apartments, commercial spaces, an entire building in a neighborhood that had appreciated over time. He spoke slowly, pausing between each revelation, as if each word was a stone he was releasing from a heavy bag he'd carried on his back for years. I asked how many properties there were. He hesitated, said he wasn't sure of the exact number, that he'd lost count, that some were just empty lots he didn't even visit anymore. But when I asked about the value, he went quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said a number so large I had to repeat it mentally to make sure I'd understood correctly. Millions. Harold, with his frayed brown coat, his worn shoes, his stories about skipping meals to save money, was a millionaire. Not just a millionaire. Rich. Very rich. The shame on his face was real. It wasn't bragging, wasn't trying to impress me. He was confessing. As if wealth were a disease he hid because no one would understand. As if having money were a moral failing that needed to be kept secret. I stared at him, trying to mentally reorganize everything he'd told me over the past months. The stories about financial difficulties, the tight retirement, the need to save at the market, none of it was true. Or rather, it was true in the way he lived, but not in the objective reality of his financial situation. Harold had chosen to live as if he were poor, had chosen to deprive himself, hide, make himself invisible. Why? I asked. The question came out more direct than I intended, but Harold didn't seem to mind. He'd been expecting it. Maybe that's why he'd started talking, because he was finally ready to answer. He told me about what happened after Margaret died. In the first months, when the pain was still raw and he could barely get out of bed, people started showing up. Relatives he hadn't seen in years, distant acquaintances, friends of friends. All with the same speech. They were there to help, to offer support, to make sure he didn't go through it alone. At first, Harold was grateful. Thought he'd finally found a support network. People who truly cared. But gradually he began to notice the pattern. The visits always ended with requests. Loans that would never be repaid. Investments in dubious businesses. Can't miss opportunities that needed immediate capital. One of the most painful cases was his nephew, Daniel. Harold told me this with a choked voice, eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. Daniel was the son of a distant cousin, but had appeared at the right time, full of energy and promises. He had a startup project, something about technology and education, brilliant on paper. Harold saw in him something that reminded him of Margaret, that ability to believe in the impossible, that unshakable faith in the future. He invested a considerable amount. Not just money, but hope. The hope that maybe people could still be good, that not everything was lost. For months, Daniel sent reports, talked about advances, asked for more resources to expand. Harold gave. He wanted to believe, needed to believe. Then, suddenly, Daniel disappeared. Didn't answer calls, didn't respond to messages. The office he claimed to have was empty, had never existed. The project was a facade, okay? And Harold realized he'd been deceived in the cruelest possible way, through his own loneliness. That blow wasn't just financial, Harold said, his voice almost inaudible. It was a blow to my soul. It's what made me build even higher walls, where these clothes live as if I had nothing. 'Cause if I had nothing in the world's eyes, no one else could take what I had. He helped others too. A cousin who needed help with an apartment down payment. A former colleague who wanted to open a store. A friend of a friend with an unmissable investment opportunity. He paid other people's debts. Financed dreams that weren't his. Not because he believed the stories, but because he wanted to believe in people. Wanted to think that at least some of them were there for him, not for the money. But the more he gave, the more requests appeared. And the more requests appeared, the more he realized no one cared about Harold. They only cared about what Harold could offer. So he stopped. Stopped answering calls. Stopped receiving visits. Stopped mentioning anything about his financial situation. Started dressing in old clothes, frequenting simple places, living as if he had nothing. And it worked. People stopped showing up. The requests ceased. His life became quieter, lonelier, but also safer. Except the loneliness he created to protect himself ended up becoming his own prison. He had enough money to do whatever he wanted, but couldn't desire anything anymore. Couldn't connect with anyone, because every connection seemed loaded with interest. Couldn't enjoy the wealth, because enjoying it meant admitting it, and admitting meant exposing himself. I listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, we sat in silence for a few minutes. I needed to process. He needed to breathe after releasing all that. Finally, I asked how he felt now, having told me. Harold said he felt relieved, but also afraid. Relieved because he'd finally lifted the weight of keeping the secret alone. Afraid because now I knew, and he wasn't sure what would happen next. Would it change how I saw him? Would I treat him differently? Would I want something from him? I said no. That my job was to help him find a way of living that made sense for him. Not to judge his choices or take advantage of the situation. That the money was part of his story, but it wasn't the whole story. That the real question wasn't how much he had, but what he was doing with it and how it was affecting his life. Harold seemed to accept that. Not completely, not yet, but enough to keep talking. And in the following sessions, he talked. Talked about the guilt of having so much when others had so little. Talked about the fear of being exploited again. Talked about the loneliness of having no one to share life with, because sharing meant running the risk of being used. We worked on this for months. I didn't have ready answers, and Harold didn't want easy solutions. What he needed was to learn to carry the weight of his own life differently. Find a balance between protecting himself and allowing himself to truly exist. Between using wealth in a way that made sense for him and not letting it become a wall that isolated him from the world. It was on an autumn afternoon with light coming through the window and painting the office golden that Harold first mentioned the idea of using the money differently. He'd spent the week thinking, he said, about what Margaret would say if she could see him now. If she would approve of how he was living, hidden, isolated, wasting years he could be using to make some difference. Margaret was always generous, he said. Donated to charities, helped neighbors who were struggling. Offered what she could to those who needed it. She didn't do it for recognition, did it because she believed it was right. And maybe, Harold thought, he could do something similar. Not the same way as her, not with the same lightness, but in a way that honored her memory and gave new purpose to the money he had. I asked what he had in mind. Harold said he didn't know exactly, but that he'd noticed things. The playground at the public school near his apartment was deteriorated, with cracked floors and torn basketball nets. The nursing home he passed on his way to the market needed repairs, had water damage on the walls and old equipment. There was a community association in the neighborhood doing adult literacy work, but operating in a borrowed room. Without adequate resources, they were small things, he said, nothing that would change the world. But they were concrete things he could do without needing to expose himself, without needing to put his name on plaques or seek recognition. He could help anonymously, ensuring the money was used correctly, and then move on. Could create impact without becoming vulnerable? I found the idea interesting. Not just for the practical aspect, but for what it meant symbolically. Harold was finding a way to emerge from the cocoon he'd created around himself, but doing it on his terms, at his pace. He wasn't opening up completely to the world, but was creating small bridges. Testing whether it was possible to connect without being hurt. He started slowly. Financed the playground renovation through an anonymous donation. But it wasn't as simple as it seemed. Harold had to deal with city bureaucracy, with architects who didn't meet deadlines, with contractors who tried to inflate the budget. Each obstacle was a test of his determination, each problem an opportunity to give up and return to the safety of isolation. But he persisted. He'd visit the construction site disguised among the residents, observe the progress, ensure everything was done with quality. When the playground was finished, he passed by on a Saturday afternoon and saw the children playing, screaming with joy, running from one side to the other. And for the first time in years, Harold felt something different from sadness. He felt purpose. Then came the nursing home. He paid for new equipment, air conditioning, more comfortable beds. He passed by the place weeks later and heard the residents commenting on the changes, on the feeling that someone cared. They didn't know who that someone was, and Harold preferred it that way. He gave funds to the community association to buy books, teaching materials, comfortable chairs. He attended a class anonymously and saw adults learning to read, their eyes shining with each decoded word. He saw dignity returning to those people's faces and realized he was witnessing something sacred, and something began to change in him. Not overnight, not dramatically, but Harold began to speak differently in sessions. His tone of voice became less heavy. The pauses between sentences less long. He smiled more, even if they were small, fleeting smiles, as if he were still learning to let them appear without fear. It was during a session in early spring that Harold mentioned the community center. He'd found an abandoned building in a neighborhood he used to cross on his way to the market. It was an old, degraded construction with broken windows and weeds growing in the cracks of the cement. But it had potential. It's well located, surrounded by residences. It could be transformed into a space for the community to gather, talk, organize activities. Harold had talked with City Hall, discovered the building was available for social projects. He hired architects, engineers, contractors, financed the complete renovation, structure, electrical, plumbing, finishing. Furnished the space with tables, chairs, shelves, a small library. Ensured there was accessibility, adequate bathrooms, a community kitchen. The project took months. And during those months, Harold faced challenges that tested his new determination. There were delays in construction, structural problems no one had foreseen, resistance from some residents who distrusted the intentions behind the project. Harold had to learn to navigate all this, to persist when it was easier to give up, to believe it was worthwhile even when everything seemed to go wrong. He followed every stage, regularly visiting the construction site, ensuring everything was done with quality. Not as owner, not as patron, but as someone who truly cared about the final result. He wanted the space to be welcoming, functional, beautiful. Wanted the people who used the center to feel that place had been made for them, with respect and care. The inauguration was scheduled for the end of the month. Harold told me this with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It would be a simple event just for the community, nothing formal. But City Hall would be there, some representatives from local associations, neighborhood residents, and Harold was considering showing up. I asked how he felt about it. He was quiet for a moment, fingers intertwined in his lap, said he was afraid of being recognized, of people discovering about the money, of everything going back to how it was before. But he also felt he needed to be there. Not to receive credit, not to be applauded, but because that project was important to him. It was a way to honor Margaret, to give meaning to his own life, to prove to himself he could connect with the world without being destroyed in the process. I said the decision was his, but that I thought he was ready. That the months of work we'd done together had been exactly about this, finding ways to exist in the world without needing to hide completely, but also without exposing himself in a way that left him vulnerable. That being at the inauguration, even briefly, was a way to celebrate not just the community center, but his own transformation. Harold thought about this for days, called twice between sessions, something he'd never done before, just to talk about it. In the first call, he said he'd decided not to go, that it was better that way, safer, that he could follow everything from afar. In the second call, he said he'd changed his mind again, that he'd show up, but just at the beginning, just to see how it was turning out. On Inauguration Day, I went to inauguration, not to supervise or intervene, but because Harold had invited me. In a shy and indirect way, and I wanted to be there for him. Wanted to see the result of the work we'd done together. Wanted to witness this moment of transformation. The neighborhood was busy that morning. Families walking toward the renovated building. Children running ahead of parents. Elderly people talking in small groups. The community center was unrecognizable. Walls painted in light colors. Clean windows without bars. The entrance garden cared for and flowering. There was a banner at the main door saying, "Welcome to our space," and music playing somewhere inside. Harold was in a corner, observing. He had come, as promised, but kept to the margins, not drawing attention. He wore the same brown coat, the same worn shoes, but there was something different in his posture. He wasn't hunched. He was just quiet, attentive, absorbing everything around. People began entering the building, exploring the rooms, touching the new furniture, leafing through the library books. There were exclamations of surprise, laughter, animated conversations. Someone brought cake. Another person brought soda. Children started playing in the outdoor area, which had been transformed into a small playground. Elderly people sat in the comfortable chairs of the main hall, commenting on how this would make a difference in the neighborhood's life. Then someone from City Hall climbed onto a small improvised stage and asked for attention. Thanked everyone for their presence, spoke about the importance of community spaces. Mentioned the work of various people who had contributed to the project. And then said there was an anonymous donor who had financed much of the renovation and would like to invite him to say a few words if he were present. Harold didn't move for a moment. Was far away on the other side of the hall, but could see the conflict on his face. The fear, the hesitation, the desire to simply leave and return to the safety of anonymity. But then he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and began walking toward the stage. People moved aside to let him pass, some frowning at seeing that simply dressed elderly man going up to speak. Harold climbed the steps carefully, held on to the edge of the stage for a second to gain stability, and then turned to look at the crowd. The silence in the hall was almost tangible. Harold stood there, not speaking, just looking at the people. I could see he was choosing his words, organizing his thoughts, trying to decide how much to reveal and how much to keep to himself. Finally, he began to speak. His voice came out low at first, but firm. Said he was happy to see so many people there. That he hoped that space would be useful to the community. That it would make a difference in the lives of those who needed it. Said he'd lost important people. That he knew what it was like to feel alone. And that he thought places like that could help people connect, not go through difficult moments isolated. He didn't mention the money. Didn't mention sacrifices or investments or how many properties he'd sold to finance the project. He just thanked the workers who had built the center, volunteers who would keep the space running, the people who had believed in the idea from the start. Thanked the community for taking care of that place, for giving it purpose. And then, surprising everyone and perhaps himself, Harold said he hoped people would use the center not just for activities, but to truly get to know each other. To talk, share stories, create genuine bonds. Said that's what he most wanted, for that space to be about real connection, not about appearances or interests, but about people being people with each other. When he came down from the stage, some people greeted him. Not many, because Harold hadn't given a memorable or emotional speech, hadn't revealed who he was or how much he donated. But those who greeted him did so with sincerity. Shook his hand, thanked him. Some even hugged. And Harold accepted all this without pulling back, without hiding, without raising the defenses he'd kept up for so long. I approached when the crowd dispersed. Harold was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the children playing outside. He saw me, waved discreetly, and I sat beside him. We stayed in silence for a few minutes, just watching. "How are you feeling?" I asked. Harold thought. Said he was tired, that it had been intense. That part of him still wanted to run away and never come back. But he was also, well, better than expected. It hadn't been as scary as he'd imagined, talking to those people, being present in that moment. And maybe, he said with hesitation, maybe he could do this more often. Not always, not in every project, but from time to time. Just show up. Be present. Remind himself it was possible to be part of the world without being consumed by it. I said I thought so, that he'd taken a huge step today, that he deserved to be proud of it. Harold didn't respond, just kept looking out the window, but I saw the small smile that appeared at the corner of his mouth, a calm, almost serene smile. We had a few more sessions after that. Harold continued showing up every week, punctual as always, but the conversations changed. He no longer talked so much about loneliness or about the fear of being used. He talked about the projects he was planning, about the communities he wanted to help, about the ways he'd found to use the money without losing himself in the process. He also talked about the people he was meeting. Not close friends, not yet, but genuine acquaintances. People who frequented the community center and greeted him when he showed up there. Volunteers who worked on other projects he financed and who talked with him about the difficulties and victories of community work. There weren't many people, and Harold still maintained a careful distance, but it was more than he'd had in years. In our last official session, Harold told me he'd decided to continue living in the simple apartment. With the same clothes, the same routine, said this was no longer about hiding or protecting himself. It was a conscious choice. He'd learned that simplicity had value in itself, that he didn't need mansions or expensive cars or designer clothes to be happy, that his wealth was in the connections he created, in the impact he caused, in the peace he'd finally found with himself. He also said he didn't need regular sessions anymore, but would like to keep in touch from time to time just to update on how things were going. I agreed. We exchanged phone numbers, something I rarely do with patients, but which in that case seemed appropriate. Harold shook my hand, thanked me for the work we'd done together, and left the office with that calm posture I'd learned to recognize. Months later, on a hot summer afternoon, I passed by the community center by chance. I was in the area visiting a friend and decided to detour just to see how the place was doing. The building remained beautiful, well-maintained, with constant movement of people coming and going. Harold was there, sitting on a bench in the outdoor area, watching a group of children playing on the playground. He didn't see me. He was completely absorbed in the scene before him, hands resting on his knees, face calm, almost serene. One of the children ran up to him, showed him a drawing she'd made. And Harold took the paper carefully, examined it attentively, said something that made the child smile before running back to her friends. I watched for a few minutes without approaching. Didn't want to interrupt that moment. Didn't need to. Because there was the answer to the question that had intrigued me since the first time Harold walked into my office: who he really was. He was a man who had chosen to carry the weight of wealth with dignity and purpose, who had learned through pain and isolation that genuine connections were worth more than any fortune, who had found a way to exist in the world without masks, without fear, without needing to be more or less than he was. Just Harold. A man who had finally made peace with himself and with the life he'd built. I walked away without him noticing, walking slowly down the street as the sound of children playing grew more distant. And I carried with me the certainty that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are those in which people simply learn to live. Without drama, without spectacle, just with the quiet courage of being who they really are. Harold's story shows us that true value isn't in what we accumulate, but in the impact we generate. What's your reflection on this? Leave your comment below. And if you were inspired by this journey of transformation, subscribe to the channel for more journeys like this.